Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese Pronunciation course, in which I will teach you how to pronounce Mandarin clearly and with confidence. In this first lesson, we are going to look at the course itself, and we're going to do so by looking at a few questions. So the first one is, can you learn to pronounce Mandarin Chinese? How hard is it? Then we're going to talk about why pronunciation matters, and then we're going to look at the course structure and how to use the course, which, as we shall see, will depend on who you are. Maybe you're a beginner, or maybe you've been learning Chinese for a while, but know that you need to work on your pronunciation. And finally, I'm going to say a few words about myself so that you know who is teaching this course. The first thing I want to say is that you can learn to pronounce Mandarin. I've heard strange things where people say that maybe you can't learn tones as an adult, or that Mandarin pronunciation is impossible for some reason. And that's nonsense. You can definitely learn to pronounce Mandarin. Now, it is true that many people don't, and that can have some consequences sometimes. I've met people who have given up learning Chinese because they spend a lot of time learning words and grammar and so on, but then when they talked with real people, those people just frowned or looked very puzzled or didn't understand anything and then switched to English. And that can be very frustrating when you've invested a lot of time and energy into learning, and the result is that people don't understand you. And that can often be the problem if you don't spend time and attention on pronunciation. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy, of course. You still need to invest that time and attention to make it work. And the good thing is that since you're watching this, I know that you're interested in pronunciation, and being interested in it and having it as a priority is a very important factor for success. Those who have the worst pronunciation are usually those who don't care at all. And so far, I haven't met a single person who cannot learn to pronounce Mandarin. And I've taught Chinese now for more than 10 years, and I've spent a lot of time coaching people specifically with pronunciation, and everybody has been able to learn, regardless of age. So let's talk a little bit about why pronunciation matters. So first, it's important for communication. If you make too many mistakes, people will find it difficult or impossible to understand what you're trying to say, and conversations will be not very smooth. Now that means that clear pronunciation is the first goal. And when I say clear pronunciation, I mean that people shouldn't confuse what sound you're trying to say with something else, and they should generally find it easy to understand what you're saying. Now, we can also go beyond that, of course, and talk about how do you sound more native, how do you sound exactly like a native speaker, and so on. And we are going to talk about those things in the course too, but clear pronunciation is the first step. And this makes it easier for native speakers to talk to you. They will enjoy talking to you much more, and it's much less likely that they will switch to English. So finally, I think we should talk about pronunciation because it's fun. Learning a foreign language is a bit like exploring a new world of sound, and maybe you don't think about it like this right now, but I hope that throughout this course I will be able to convince you that pronunciation is actually very interesting. Now, let's look at the course structure a little bit. The course has 5 sections, and the first one is Introduction, and that's what we're doing now. And the other lessons in this section generally talk about the course itself, about how to learn pronunciation, and summarizes various important things. We also look at various techniques and methods that you can use to improve your pronunciation. Then sections 2, 3, and 4 deal with the most basic parts of Chinese pronunciation, and that is then tones, of course. And if you're new to Mandarin, tones are changes in pitch that make the difference between different words. So, for example, ma and ma would mean two different things. And it doesn't do that in English, so that's something we want to discuss. In section 3, we're talking about initials, and that is the start of a syllable in Mandarin. And then we're going to finish the syllable with talking about finals in section 4. And we're going to talk about all the sounds in Mandarin, so when we've completed this course, you will be familiar with all the initials, all the finals, and all the tones. Then in section 5, we're going to look at connected speech, so that's everything that is basically anything that is longer than a syllable, so that would mean maybe rhythm, stress, and intonation, things like that. And beyond the video lessons, there are also other things in the course that you should use to improve your pronunciation. We have lots of audio files, and we have both male and female native speakers that you can use to mimic, and that's important because it allows you to have a voice that is at least a little bit like your own. We also have audio flashcards you can use for listening practice, and we also have an option to receive professional feedback. Now, how do you get the most out of a course like this? Well, first and foremost, I want to say that the course is for all students, and how you use it depends on who you are and if you're a beginner or not, or if you've already learned Chinese for some time. Don't feel that you have to do everything at once, especially not if you're a beginner. There's a lot of content here, so going through everything will take a while, and feel free to skip things or feel free to focus on the things that matter to you. And I also suggest that you study and use Chinese in parallel with this course, because we are talking about pronunciation here, and I think pronunciation is very important and interesting, but there are, of course, other parts of learning Chinese as well. You need words, you need grammar, you need to speaking practice, listening practice, you need all of those things as well. So do learn Chinese in parallel with the course, and that could be maybe a university course, maybe you're studying on your own, I don't know, but study Chinese in parallel with the course. Some extra guidance for beginners then. There is a beginner study plan that sorts and arranges the content of this course into a sequence that makes sense if you're relatively new to learning Chinese. You don't have a good grasp of pinyin and you maybe don't know that much about pronunciation yet. So this will simply guide you through the content in a logical order. And of course, you can choose the pacing yourself. I mean, it says day 1, 2, 3 here and so on. But if you want to study, much more intensively than that, that's fine. And if you want to take, a break, or you take longer intervals between pronunciation sessions, that's completely fine. And this sequence puts tones first. That doesn't mean necessarily that tones are the most important thing, but it tends to be the thing that most students neglect, and some people maybe think that tones are not that important and so on. So I put it first because it's the thing that we need to reinforce the most for most people. The second advice here is to listen as much as possible. And there are a lot of people who learn pronunciation and try to say things very early. They try to speak a lot and learn pronunciation that way. But actually, we need a lot of listening to be able to know what these sounds are supposed to sound like. Without that the idea, that model of how this language sounds, it's very difficult to pronounce it well. And in this course, we will go through pinyin in great detail. We will learn everything you need to know to pronounce it well. But it is very important that you learn it well. A lot of problems with pronunciation in Mandarin comes from the fact that people don't learn Mandarin that well, or they just guess. They read it as if it were English, and it isn't. And if you do that, your pronunciation will honestly be quite bad. So don't do that. So feedback is also important because it can guide your learning, tell you what you need to reinforce, and also tell you what you're doing well and you maybe don't need to focus on that much. And I also suggest then, since there is a lot of content, you can watch through things, and if you think they are difficult, return to them later, maybe next week, maybe next month, maybe a year from now. So the course can be your companion along your journey. So now over to some advice for more advanced students, and here I mean anyone who is not a beginner. And the question we need to ask is, do you know how good your pronunciation is? Do you know what your weakest links are? And if you do, it should be fairly easy. You know what to prioritize, you know you have these errors, and you can start working on them. Now, if you don't know what your weakest links are, then you should definitely figure that out as soon as possible. Because if you don't know that, it's going to be very difficult to put your time where it matters most. And to help you to do this, we have a progress tracker where you can note down your feedback, work on a certain area of pronunciation, and then note down follow-up feedback and see how you improve over time. And this course has been built on 4 principles. And the first one is listening. And I've said that a few times already, and I will say it again. Listening is very important. Of course, listening is nice because you can understand what other people say. That is kind of obvious. But it's also important because it gives you a lot of evidence or a lot of data of how the language is supposed to sound, and you really need that. So listen as much as you can, not just in the course, but listen to Chinese as much as you can outside of these pronunciation lessons as well. Next is mimicking, which is a very powerful tool to learn pronunciation. It's good for initials, finals, and tones, but it's especially good at learning things like rhythm and stress. So mimicking is simply trying to sound exactly like a native speaker and saying things alongside a native speaker. And that allows you to focus both on the listening, but then also your own speaking, and compare the two and listen attentively and try to figure out what the difference is and how you can improve. And understanding is another concept that is very important here. So kids, when they grow up, they learn their native language, not effortlessly necessarily, but they do so automatically. They don't have to study, they don't have to pay attention, like consciously trying to learn pronunciation. But adults need that. And it's very easy to prove this because most people who live in China and have been living there for a long time, they don't have very good pronunciation. And the reason is that they haven't invested the time and energy to do it. It does not happen automatically. And 4 is feedback is essential. Without feedback, you don't really know what you're doing. It's very hard to evaluate your learning, like you don't know how good your pronunciation is, and you don't know what your most important issues are. And without knowing that, it's also very difficult to prioritize. So feedback can also tell you what does not work, how you cannot pronounce things. Because if you think about it, if you listen a lot, like I said before, you will get a good idea of how things are supposed to sound, and that can help you, but you won't get much information about what does not work. And therefore, feedback can be useful when someone simply tells you that you're wrong here, you cannot say this, native speakers don't do that, or it's hard to understand, or something like that. Naturally, not all feedback is like that. We also have implicit feedback where you can, for example, if someone is frowning when you're speaking with them, or they ask what a lot, or something like that, you can probably figure out that something is wrong with the way you speak. Now, it doesn't have to be pronunciation. It could be that your vocabulary is off or something. But you should look for these clues as to how people react when you speak, and then you can gradually try to figure out if you have a problem and what it is. Naturally, though, it is easier when someone actually tells you straight out, this is the problem and this is what you should do. So sadly, this doesn't happen nearly as often as it should. In most courses, pronunciation is something that is taught in the beginning of the semester, and then if you learn pronunciation in a few weeks, well, good for you. But for most people who need more time than that, they're usually left to their own devices. Their teachers usually don't correct pronunciation that much. They might say something occasionally, but usually not. I will share with you a personal story in a minute here that can show you an example of just that. So let me say a few words about myself so we can get to know each other. My name is Ole Linge and I'm from Sweden. I started learning Chinese in 2007 in a very typical foreign language environment, like at a university. And since then, I've been learning Chinese in a lot of different situations. I've been learning in an immersion environment, online, offline, full time for many years, but also part time while working or while studying other things. So I've done almost everything you can in terms of learning the language. And throughout this process, I also gradually became aware that there were lots of things that didn't really make sense, or some things that people just didn't talk about. And that is why I launched Hacking Chinese, which is more than 10 years ago now. And I started writing about, how do you learn Chinese? Because teachers tended to give us lots of words to learn and grammar patterns to memorize and maybe pronunciation sometimes. But no one told us how to do these things. How do we learn them? So that's what I focus on most. And since then, I've also done lots of other things. I've studied in a master's program for teaching Chinese as a second language, taught entirely in Chinese. I've also taught a lot of Chinese, and in the past 6 years, I've worked with professional development for language teachers, and that essentially means working with them to improve the way they teach languages. And during this time, I've been interested mostly in 2 areas, and one of them is how to learn. We talked about that already. And the other one is, of course, pronunciation. And pronunciation is something that I've been interested in longer than I've been learning Chinese, actually. I got interested in it when I studied English at university, and I had this professor who convinced me that pronunciation is quite interesting. And before that time, I thought about phonetics maybe in terms of some weird symbols that a teacher of French or English in high school forced us to learn or something like that. I wasn't very interested. But he opened the door and he showed me how interesting pronunciation can be if you do it properly. So that's what I hope I can do with you in this course. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm a prodigy or extremely talented when it comes to learning pronunciation or anything like that. I've spent an awful lot of time and energy learning to pronounce the languages that I speak. And to give you an example of this, I'll share a little anecdote about something that I learned incorrectly when I started learning Chinese. And this won't make sense if you just started learning Chinese, but we're going to talk about this in section 2. But I made a mistake with a third tone. I misunderstood how it was pronounced, so I said it like that for 2 years before anyone pointed it out to me. And I had more than 10 teachers over that time, and no one directly told me that I was doing this thing. And I don't blame the teachers really. They were overall quite good teachers. Maybe they had too many students. Maybe they had students who, got a bit defensive when you pointed out that something was not right or something like that. It does happen. But it is something that took me many, many hours to fix. And now, 10 years later, I can still sometimes make this mistake, even though I, of course, hear when I make it and I can correct myself. But the reason I'm saying this is that the part of the point of this course is to help you avoid making such mistakes. Now, if you're hearing this and you kind of have studied Chinese for a while and know that you might have mistakes like that, well, just know that I've been through this myself. I know how time-consuming and frustrating it can be. So this course is really the result of everything I've been saying here, all the time I've spent learning Chinese, teaching Chinese, doing professional development, research, all these things have kind of come together into this course, and that's why I'm so excited to be here with you. So let's recap briefly what we talked about here. So first, you can learn Mandarin pronunciation. You definitely can. It does require time and energy, but if you're willing to spend that, you can learn. And the first goal should be clear pronunciation, and that means that people should find it easy to understand what you're trying to say. They shouldn't have to struggle, and they definitely shouldn't hear the wrong thing. So that should be the goal for everybody. And how you use this course then depends on who you are. Beginners should maybe follow the study guide, and more advanced students should base their learning off their personal needs. And those should, of course, be decided by feedback. What do you know about your pronunciation? What is your weakest link? Work on that first. And then we looked at the 4 core principles of the course, which are listening, understanding, mimicking, and then feedback. So a warm welcome to the pronunciation course. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next lesson.